You're listening to the Anxiety Reset Podcast. I'm your host, Georgie Collinson, anxiety mindset coach, naturopath, hypnotherapist, and creator of the Anxiety Reset Method. This is where I help women with high-functioning anxiety, just like you, master that anxious mind. Welcome to the show, Helen Jacobs. I am so happy to have you here.
I am super excited to be here and chatting with you, so thank you for having me.
Now, you're a return guest. You've been on the Anxiety Reset podcast before, and I love it when there's been a nice interim in between because there's always so much to catch up on. Beautiful space around you, by the way. For those who are just listening to the audio, there's just lovely, you've got beautiful plants, and are those crystals behind you?
Yeah, I've got some crystals and books and bits and pieces. I also have the bruises on my arm from moving everything in the break and getting my office reset. So I'm glad you noticed.
So it's a brand new space for you, Helen?
No, just rearranged.
Rearranged. Okay.
Mm.
Ready for the new year.
Yes.
And since we've spoken last, you have written another book, Follow Your Heart, which is such a needed guide, I think, because so many people talk about following your heart, but how do we actually do that?
Well, it takes a bit of practice, right? And we have to make sure that there's a distinction between our true heart. So it might be some different language for different people, our intuition or a higher self, maybe that sort of more knowing part of us, as opposed to, say, our romantic heart or our emotional heart. Those things can help us, but they are different.
Yeah.
It does take a bit of practice to figure it all out.
Totally. I mean, I could follow my heart to like chocolate every day, but that's what we mean, right?
Yeah, not what we mean. But look, on the odd occasion, sure. But I would hazard a guess if your heart, quote unquote, was leading you to chocolate every day, it's not really your heart. It wouldn't do that to you.
Yeah, that's where we know there might be something else underneath that, underlying that.
Mm-hmm.
So, Helen, this is your third book, and you mentioned that, I don't know if you meant that it's been the easiest of the three to write, but you mentioned writing this one was particularly easeful and it flowed through you.
Yes, and it's so nice to say that. I know that you've just written a book and I don't know what your experience is, but it's not always the case that it's, so joyful and easy. But I think it might be like anything else with a bit of practice, it does become easier. But this book is also very practical and instructional. And I was really just relaying my actual routine for trusting my intuition. So it wasn't like I was really diving into anything new. It was very well lived and well experienced, and therefore quite easy to write.
Yeah, I can understand that. And what is it that with this book, if there was like a takeaway that someone reading it could take, what would that sort of key message be?
One key message. I'd like there to be more. I think ultimately that we have, in the book, I call our heart an antenna. And that if we understand that it is receiving and transmitting information, the game changes. So I would love for people to understand that what their heart is telling them is really useful information. How we're interacting with the world around us is really useful information. And if we know what to do with that information, we can really change our whole life. I really believe that.
Yeah, beautiful. I feel, just being devil's advocate here, so many of us, I would say, particularly coming out of the last 2 years, where in some form or another, everyone's had a bit of a shock or a bit of a change to their life or what they thought life was going to look like. I'm obviously referring to the pandemic, but we have it could have been a breakup. It could have been losing your job or something not working out the way you thought it would. And when these moments happen, we often feel disheartened and disappointed with life and tend to go more towards And I do this when something big challenges me. It's like, what can I control? And control, I want to control, like I want plans, I want numbers, I want trajectories, I want to know how everything's going to go. But how do we kind of reconcile that with following our heart in these times when we are perhaps more anxious, more afraid, and listening to that really loud voice that's doubting and not trusting?
I think it's actually really important that we start small. And that's actually something that I did talk about more in my first book. In this book, in Follow Your Heart, I do spend quite a bit of time really talking about the difference between our head and our heart. And following our heart doesn't mean ignore your head, because that would be kind of silly. I wouldn't have turned up for this appointment. I wouldn't know where my children are. I may not have done washing. Like, there's some really practical life survival skills that our brain, our mind gives us. So it's actually just understanding the role that each of them play. And also, I think that there is a place for disappointment. There is place for feeling like, the world was, and I don't know if I can swear on your podcast, but it wasn't such a nice place in the last couple of years.
You can definitely swear. I find it
Okay.
therapeutically relevant to swear sometimes. Any of my clients know I'm a big fan of that and required.
I don't mind swearing. But, the last couple of years was pretty effed up. I still can't bring myself to do it. But there's a place for it.
Yeah.
And sometimes it is much bigger than us, like a pandemic, but sometimes it is something of our own volition, something closer to home that we still can't control. But we learn from that, and if nothing else, we're actually learning what we can and can't control.
Yeah.
And I say that with a smile on my face, because I actually fall in that same camp, right? It's not like I've got some magic life where I'm not human and experiencing these things. We're all in that same boat.
So you mean even with your amazingly strong, clear connection to your guides, your spiritual support team, you don't get a free ride out of being a human, Helen?
No. It certainly at times can be easier, but everything has everything has duality. So this has its downsides too.
Yeah, I understand. And so, okay, let's try and bring some context into this. I mean, there's a lot of talk at the moment around recession and economic. I mean, I actually really prefer the word correction, because language is so powerful, but it's bringing in a collective fear. So looking at perhaps navigating following our heart through a time like this, just to bring some relevance to something maybe that people can relate to in their lives, how can we sort of follow our hearts through something like this, particularly when there's so much fear? We're seeing it in the news, we're seeing it on social media.
It's a really great question, and I think it's just really important to note that what I'm about to say is really general in nature, right? Because everyone's experience is going to be different. We do need to be mindful that we are influenced but not controlled by outside forces. And so that is true of our economic condition, our society, cultural influences and references. So those things absolutely exist, and our head needs to be aware of them. But it doesn't mean that we are imprisoned by those conditions. And so by practicing knowing what you truly desire, and I detail this in the book, using your head to support that. It might not be, in a economic correction, for someone who might want to rush out and leave their job, and it might not be the best decision financially, that you would know that that's where you're headed, but you do all the other work so that when life and your desire matches up, you're ready. I think we have to be really careful to conflate or confuse following our heart without, or rather, following it with reckless abandon.
Yeah.
There is still a place for logic.
Yeah.
And there's a very fine line between which one we're ruled by.
I love that this has come up because I was literally just having a conversation similar to this with a client of mine who is feeling like her heart is not really in her career at the moment.
Mm.
And she would love to follow her heart into a floristry business.
Oh.
However, I can see that as we talked through, maybe this is not a right now thing. It's a thing
Mm-hmm.
we could maybe work towards. But if she were to do that tomorrow and just quit the job and start the business, she might end
Mm-hmm.
up creating more stress and more, I suppose, for want of a better word, chaos in her life that might be
Mm-hmm.
unnecessary. And potentially
Yes.
the more loving approach could be something gentler, a gentler transition over time. We don't always have to do these massive leaps of faith, even though I love those. You know what I mean?
But I mean, imagine if you were leaping off a cliff every single day. I think it would end up losing its appeal, right?
Yeah.
uh, uh, the other side of that is, in the book, I address this through what I call the ARIA method, which is really just an acronym for asking, receiving, interpreting, and acting on our guidance. And so there can be a physical time difference between knowing what our heart wants, for example, leaving a career to become a florist, but the actual action comes much later. And so we can know where we're going, but it doesn't mean that every single intuitive hunch that we get needs to be actioned immediately. And in fact, I would highly recommend that we don't do that. Um, the flip side of that is, and I say this as someone who many years ago did just walk out on a career to become a psychic, no less. In my particular case, I honestly can see in hindsight, I needed to jump in order to make a big mess of it and to figure it out. I don't think that everyone else needs to do that.
And imagine if the first moment it was challenging, for example, being a psychic or some kind of
Mm-hmm.
challenge came up in that, which I'm sure inevitably something
Mm.
would have, you'd gone, oh, well, this can't be the right thing. I'll jump again.
Yes. And look, there are certainly things that, I know in my own life that there are things that I might have jumped between and possibly even still do, and we don't know that until afterwards anyway. Um, but it's all a learning experience. So, if we feel like we've quote unquote got it wrong, or I jumped too early, or I didn't jump at all, it's all good.
Yeah.
It's not like there is only one pathway. And really, if we're feeling like that, it's because our head is telling us that there is this only one way to get there, or this is the time it needs to happen in. Our heart couldn't care less. Our soul might be really cool with it happening next lifetime, but our heads are like, what? No,
Yeah.
I want it to happen next week.
Yeah. Otherwise, I feel like it's life or death, maybe.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I have two questions for you because I feel
Yes.
like we've jumped straight into talking about following your heart and guidance and everything, when potentially someone's listening to this thinking,
Mm.
what does that even mean, following guidance? Where's the guidance coming from?
Yes.
Am I asking my my spiritual mentor or my friend or my mom? What do we mean by following your heart and following that guidance?
Yes, I love that. Thank you for bringing me back. What I'm really talking about is listening to your own intuition and the wisdom that you have in your body, and understanding the true wisdom, that true voice, or what I said before, I'm just calling your heart as a blanket term, versus perhaps our anxiety and fear, our mind, the societal expectations, the roles, the rules, all of the things that socialize and condition us. So when I'm talking about guidance, first and foremost in this book, it is about our own intuition. But yes, I guess if someone has not come into my orbit before, they may not know that I am a psychic and I do commune with, a whole range of guided beings, which, I do believe that everyone can do, but it's certainly not a prerequisite to pick up this book. So we can have our inner guidance, or what I call higher guidance from, say, our spirit guides and guardian angels, that sort of thing. And to your question, you said, well, does that mean I'm asking a mentor or my mom or a sister? I mean, obviously, we're always turning to our loved ones and, coaches or mentors for advice, but it's not always the same thing as our own intuition.
Yeah. Yeah. And ultimately, on the hierarchy of, I don't want to use the word should, but like where it's best to take that guidance. Where does intuition fall beyond like talking to people in our lives too?
Can I get you are you asking, is it better to rely on our intuition more than other people's advice?
Yeah, I'm kind of like, where's the hierarchy there? Does it go like, listen to your intuition first, ask family and friends second?
Look, I don't think that I could say there's a hard and fast rule to it. I think ultimately you'd want the final decision to be true to you.
Yeah.
But like I was kind of joking before, like we are all human and our mind does want data, and we can learn from other people's experiences. It just doesn't mean that their experience will be true for us. And so understanding who we are, what makes us tick, what we do desire most in our true self, in our heart, is ultimately going to guide us more than someone else's experience.
Yeah. I love that. And I love that feeling. I don't have it all the time, but when I'm trying to make a big decision and there's just that calm knowing of, yes, this is the right thing. It's such a good feeling, no matter what noise is happening on the outside.
And once you get that feeling, we don't necessarily want to attach or hang on to it, but gee, it would be nice to hang on for dear life and not lose it again, right? It's sometimes a fleeting feeling. And I talk about this in the book. I call it a full body yes versus a maybe or a full body no. And if I don't have that yes feeling, and mine would be different from yours and the next person, then it's a wait. And it comes back to what I was talking about before. Action isn't always an immediate next step from the knowing.
Yeah.
There is often a gap in between. And sometimes we need our physical body and our mind to catch up with what our heart does already know. And that can take time.
And I think when this is like one of the most common questions that comes up, it's like, how do we know the difference between anxiety and fear or intuition? Because, you could meet someone and feel like anxious because perhaps you're projecting something from the past. Maybe that person has said something that sounded like your ex-partner, and all of a sudden you're like, this is going to be the exact same person again. And often that turns out to not necessarily be the case. And we could mistake that for intuition kind of protecting us. Maybe it's something happens with a job interview and we're like, oh, I just didn't like the vibe of the people. But again, it's working out, is that your stuff from past fearful experiences, subconscious programming, or is it intuition? What's your take on that question, Helen?
Yeah, I think it's such a great question. And I think there is an element of trial and error, unfortunately, that if you're going to commit to this, that you do need to kind of figure out your unique threshold, for want of a better word. But my take on it is this: we can't rely on our intuition in these heightened moments or big life-altering changes and decisions if we haven't figured out some of this stuff first. And so in the book, I talk about having this rhythm and ritual, that the book is actually helping you to develop a daily practice of listening to yourself, listening to your body, actually understanding what is racing through your mind and what your heart is telling you, so that you're starting to build up over time an understanding of, oh no, that is the voice of my anxiety, or actually that was triggered by this past experience. It's almost well, I'm going to say therapeutic, but not to replace an actual therapist, but there is this process of coming to know yourself in such a way that you can tell the difference.
Yeah.
And look, ultimately, it may not matter that if we're so caught up in analyzing and judging our intuition, we may have actually missed the point anyway. And that we're here to learn and experience. And part of that experience and learning, and even with our intuition, is getting it quote unquote wrong. That was the whole point of the experience.
That's you getting it right.
Correct. Your soul will be high-fiving, going, yeah, she's learning this, she's got it. Whereas our human self is like, oh my God, I've messed it up. I've broken everything. And actually our soul is like, well, thank God you did.
So my mind likes to go, when we start talking down this path, my mind likes to go, oh God, so I'm just being led into an endless, like vortex of nothing. And
like a house of mirrors that
and everything's meaningless, and I'm never going to have things that I want. And to some degree, like the mind in us, I suppose, is never fully satisfied, because there's always something that we desire more. But I reconcile it by thinking about the fact that there are so many beautiful, wonderful experiences that have come into my life that my mind could never have fathomed, that my soul has led me to. For example, even just us on this podcast and me doing this work, like I didn't know that I was going to be doing this 5-10 years ago, when I was like, or 10 years ago, when I was in my whole confusion about what I was going to do with my life.
I think, without wanting to get too esoteric about it, I think it's really understanding that we are having this human experience in a 3-dimensional world. It's physical, it's tangible. There's the serendipitous part of our life and the messy part, and a very real human experience. But there's also, I believe, this higher part of us that has chosen to come here to begin with. And so if we're just to think in terms of this, if we think about them as like levels in a building, right? So on level 1, it's, or an avatar maybe, there's this really tangible experience, and then there's sort of almost this inconceivable, intangible experience that is happening. It is often easier to stay in the tangible and want meaning. But the meaning that we attach to something, that our mind attaches to it, is different from what our soul, source, this, what I think is a higher power. There's so much more meaning in that void, in that space, than our mind could even fathom.
Which makes a lot of sense to me from the perspective of the work I do with hypnotherapy and people's beliefs, and that everything is a perspective. And so, yeah, there are so many perspectives, and I can only imagine what our soul's perspective is on our tangible human lives.
And it's very different. And we said this before, the things that frustrate us are, it's like, why am I learning this again? Why am I having this experience? And soul is like clapping happily, not in an evil sort of way. It's like, oh, she might actually learn it this time, or, oh, this is so good, because the soul wants the experience.
Yeah.
Whereas our human self is like, oh, I don't want to experience that. That's painful. That's hurtful. That's messy. That's unstable.
Yes.
Yeah.
I often think of it like, I don't know if you ever explored this, but there was this computer game called The Sims. It's still around.
Yeah, I know the one.
A virtual world, and you create your characters, and it was really fun to mess up their lives. And not not that I'm saying this is what the universe is doing to us, but it helps me understand a little bit. It was so boring when you had all the cheat codes and you could do everything and like everything was happy families. It was boring.
Oh, that is awesome. Yeah, and it's as a way of our mind conceptualizing it, I think it's a perfect example, right? I don't know that there is really this sort of evil force that is like, oh, let's just make a mess of this. I know they need a pandemic. I know they need the economic correction. It's not quite like that, but yeah, it can certainly feel like it.
I don't think it's evil intent. I just think it's more like, oh, this
Yes,
is interesting. I'm curious about this. What would happen here?
absolutely.
So
Yes.
playing The Sims, anyone who played that game, you were having a godlike experience.
Well, I mean, this kind of was going to take us in a whole other direction, but I was watching as Facebook became Meta and announced this like metaverse and where it's going. And it's kind of the same idea, right? Except we're not just manipulating like the Sims, we're actually manipulating ourselves and others in this virtual world. But anyway, that's a whole other conversation. But is it Inception where it's like the dream inside the dream inside? It's yeah.
It's very much down that whole, oh gosh, metaverse. I'm not ready.
Don't no. I'm struggling just in 3D, guys. Like let's let's just stay here.
But going back to a practical example of, connecting to the intuition and how it can be so powerful. I was telling you, Helen, before we hit record, I woke up this morning and my cat was missing. And there's certain patterns, and he's always usually around in the morning. He wants breakfast and he just wasn't there, and he didn't turn up until 1 minute before our interview, which made me a couple of minutes late. So he's fine. But through the kind of worry that came in, I asked my intuition, is he okay? And I got a very clear yes. And I don't know if I would say, I mean, I've been following your work for years, working on connecting to my intuition. So I would say that there's enough of a strength of connection that I could feel the intuitive yes through that, even though there was some worry, some anxiety in my body. Mentally, my head was like, is this okay? That he's not here. I can't see that he's okay. But my heart was saying yes. And, just on that level, I hope that's a interesting example for people of like how it can work.
Yeah, I love that example. And also I'm so glad that he came back. I love that he came back just in time for our conversation. But it is, you've cultivated that knowledge of yourself, right? You've cultivated the difference between the anxious thoughts or the worry and what your body, what your true self is telling you. And it's okay to still be worried or to experience anxiety. And actually, before we did hit record, I was saying to you, yeah, I am actually someone who does experience anxiety, and it really can go off the chart at times. But it's usually referencing something else for us to look into, as you know, to inquire into, and why are these feelings here and what internally could change. In the book, I talk about this idea of the feedback loop, where we're constantly exchanging information energetically through the heart antenna with the universe around us. And so we can have this desire, say, changing jobs or buying a house or whatever it might be. And each little interaction, even seemingly unrelated, in this instance, your cat, that we're building up this knowledge of who we are and what we want and who we want to be and what we want to offer. And it's just through those little simple things each day that actually all add up.
I'd be so sorry, go on. I didn't realize you weren't finished.
No, I'm finished.
I was just gonna say, I know there have been times like in the not too distant past where, say, going through a breakup or contemplating, like, do I stay with this person or not? And my intuition goes all over the place there. Like I get very confused at times in such a weighty decision. But I wonder if, as time has gone on, in a similar situation, I might have more clarity.
Absolutely. It's like any other muscle. The more that you're using it, the less thought, for want of a better word, is actually going into the process, right? So earlier you said, oh, this book, you wrote it quite quickly. It's because it's actually the practice that I've done every day, right? And so it was easy for me to write, but it's also really easy for me in a split moment to very quickly run through essentially a checklist, right? So that if I had to, not that I foresee it, but if I had to change careers again, or I had to take a big leap, it may not take me, 6 months like it did last time of like, am I going to quit? Where am I going? Like all of the processing, it becomes faster and more trusted and more familiar
Yeah.
than the familiarity that we have already established with our mind or anxiety and programming.
And while I agree with you that big decisions like this, it's fine for them to take time, for the true answer to be right now to wait. There's nothing worse than lingering in a state of purgatory when you do know what you're meant to do, and you just hang around in
Yes.
the in between for months,
Hmm.
maybe even years.
Yeah, and it can be painful, right? Like that can be excruciating, which Sol would say, wonderful. She's having this hard time with this. But I think the other thing that's here is really understanding that process. And um, there was a point I was going to make from the book. Oh, it's escaped me. Maybe Spirit actually doesn't want me to share it.
I'm sure it'll come back in
Oh, it'll come back.
just a moment. Happens to me
Oh, that's
all
so
the time, Helen.
strange.
I have so many questions. I mean, before I was like,
Yeah.
I've got two questions for you, and I never asked the
Oh,
second.
yeah. Well, I didn't even realize.
Well, the second question I had for you was almost like, while your brain jumps back onto that bit,
Yes.
was around the idea of if someone is needy, like not sure about connecting to their intuition, like they just hear
Mm.
their thoughts and they don't know, like, am I making this up? Any guidance around troubleshooting that connection, particularly if it's not so familiar?
Yes. So there is what I call a rhythm and ritual to this process. And so in Follow Your Heart, I talk about a very simple daily practice. And there's a range of tools that you can employ, depending on what you're feeling. But generally speaking, it's journaling, meditation, movement, and and expression. And so if we are doing these little things each day and observing them, I think the observer, the non-attached, non-judgmental observation of ourselves, um, so that we can actually see what our own patterns are. We can see how our intuition is developing. And it doesn't have to be this arduous experience. It's really a few minutes each day. But as that builds up, we are building that muscle. We're recognizing, oh, you know what? I interpreted this piece of guidance this way, and actually that was my fear. And so now I know that for next time. So essentially, it can be as little or as long as you want, preferably each morning, where you ask a question and you let your body, or it may be with oracle cards, it may be through meditation, you let the answers come. And then you would also need to check when you need to act. And then if you need to act, you act. So hopefully you've practiced on the little things first.
Yeah.
But it's really just a process of getting to know yourself, really.
And ensuring, I suppose, that we're living our authentic life. I mean,
Mm.
not necessarily living based on conditioning or autopilot programming. I certainly know
Mm-hmm.
that's something that really fuels me in my work, is helping people see beyond the hamster wheel kind of life of, well,
Mm-hmm.
this is just what I do because everyone else is doing it. Or at least I look like I'm busy and important.
Yeah, yes. Well, good luck. But we've all been there, right? Like
Totally.
it's, yeah, it's so relatable. but yeah, it's I think it is a choice, or perhaps a lifestyle choice. I don't feel like our intuition is something that we can think about in terms of, I'll use it today and not tomorrow. And if we were doing that, then we're probably more head based than we are heart based or truly trusting ourselves. It's kind of like our mind is tricking us into thinking that we're following our intuition, which is why I think we need to have a regular practice, whatever that may be, so that we know ourselves and can actually chart our progress, which, by the way, the mind will love. The mind will love that kind of proof and tangibility.
Yeah, beautiful. And I think I love the way you very clearly state the interplay between the head and the heart. It's not like your mind is bad. It's not like even fear is a bad thing. It's
Fear is very useful. Yeah. It's what we do with it and which part of us is in the driver's seat, so to speak, right? That we want to understand how to maximize it. Like, we don't want to live lives that are miserable or fear-based to the extreme, perhaps, where we can't even leave our home. We want to be living really rich, full, meaningful lives. I truly believe that that's what all of us want. But my version of a true, meaningful life will be very different from yours or anyone else that's listening, right?
totally.
And so, coming back to that point that you made before about, well, am I asking my mom or my sister? It's like, well, you can ask them, but their meaningful life, what their heart desires, how they've been conditioned, maybe your sister's family are similar, but their beliefs, how they view the world will change how they see things. So do we really want to be following their path? No, I'd rather be
Not.
following my own. So
And yet we have such a powerful driver in us to belong and connect for our own survival, be a part of your family, stay within those same themes and values. There's the universe having some fun, isn't it?
I was just about to say something similar, because my belief is that the soul's chosen it, right? We've chosen this time to be on this planet. We've chosen our families. We've actually chosen the lesson. So, we've kind of referenced anxiety naturally on your podcast a few times today. But I think that it's an experience that our soul has also chosen.
Yeah.
That day to day, with all the challenges that anxiety can bring, we're learning through that. But our soul at a much higher level is really, for me anyway, it has been about, well, how much do you really trust? And that idea of belonging isn't just a physical belonging with our family or society, the very formative roots that we have. Ultimately, where we belong is much more esoteric, spiritual, non-tangible. So none of us can ever not belong.
Oh, I love that perspective on belonging. Oh, Helen, I'm going to use that.
Great, go forth. Take that, run. But it can change our, this idea of the two perspectives. It changes, and it's actually a lesson that I've worked with at a really human level. The idea of not belonging, being the odd one out, being the psychic kid who had these experiences that no one really knew, and what to do with me. And yet there was something so much bigger than what we were tangibly seeing, feeling, and experiencing here that I was a part of. Something so much bigger.
And I imagine would have given you a sense of a connection in a way, even when perhaps the humans in your life were unable to relate on that level.
Yeah. And, I think the idea of connection, and this has been said elsewhere, and the pandemic certainly reflected it back to us. But for all of our technology and all of the ways in which we're trying to connect with one another, we've really missed the point. It's and I don't think that we can have true connection with other people until we've had that connection with ourselves. And so how do we have that connection with ourselves? Well, you've got to get to know yourself. You're going to have to work through your own stuff to like yourself or love yourself. And if you can do that, then you're able to, keep evolving and growing. And, I don't think that, to come back to your comment before about the economic correction and the pandemic and all the things that are happening out there, we may not solve a pandemic by feeling connected to ourselves, or we may not, counterbalance what's happening economically simply by connecting with ourselves. But if each and every one of us did that, and each and every one of us was trusting that this is all happening for us and not to us, we'd have this righted fairly quickly. But we're not
Yeah.
there yet.
Yeah. And I would say as well, like on a similar vein, anxiety, I always feel, is ultimately, and I'm saying this quite generally, but we experience the one side of the extreme so that we can come to know the extreme version of trust. Like the total fear and I can't trust anything in life and everything's coming to get me, to it will ultimately ideally bring you to a place where even you get a glimpse of what it's like to really just flow in life. And that's the gift that anxiety can give us. We wouldn't know where to look to find that if we didn't see where the absence of it was, right? Or we need to look at where our disconnections are to find out where to reconnect.
Yes. And, I think over the years, as I've been doing this work, more and more people are even just simply coming to meditation or seeing that there are small tools that they can be using. But this wasn't really a conversation before the pandemic, and certainly not 15 years ago when I started this on a much bigger scale. But I think we've all really started to understand, because so many of us all at once experience that discomfort and disconnection and isolation and worry and fear, that what's actually been bubbling beneath the surface now has to be dealt with. And so we see that at a collective level, but it's also happening at our individual level. So I absolutely agree with you that if we don't have that discomfort, um, or if the Sims were just happily kicking around every day, what's the point of that?
Yeah, no one's growing, no one's learning.
No, no. I mean, it's certainly, it's not about that sort of self. Um, we don't want to seek out difficulty to say, "Oh, I'm growing," and "Oh, look at me, doing hard things." That's at the other extreme. That sort of martyrdom of like, "Oh, I must be great because I'm able to do all of this hard stuff." It's, I think, all of it coming back to that middle point, right?
Yeah, that middle ground in between,
Mm-hmm.
somewhere in the in between, when all our mind
Mm-hmm.
wants to is all or nothing.
Mm-hmm. And how interesting that our heart is right there in the middle.
Oh, Helen, that's beautiful. In terms of your experience of being way in your head, not so much in your heart, do you have a story of a time where you had to kind of work your way back to your heart? And what did that look like?
Um, yeah, I mean, the last couple of years, like everyone else, um, I did have to work through my own initial fears when the pandemic hit, juggling, homeschooling, we're all familiar with it.
Mm.
Um, but because I had spent at that stage, what, 12, 13 years of practicing every single day, I feel like it was almost like a marathon I'd been building for my entire life, or the last 15 years at least. Um, so I do work myself back by actually coming back to my practice, coming back to sitting and creating stillness, listening to my body. What does it need? Does it need more movement, less movement, change of food, whatever it might be? Um, I've also learned in the last couple of years for me personally that asking for help is actually a really important part of the process. And it's ironic because we were saying before about asking for advice. Asking for help and asking for advice can be two very different things. Um, but part of that idea of working ourselves back to ourselves is actually asking those around us who do know us well to remind us if we can't know that for ourselves, right? That if we're too deep in it. So, yeah, I mean, it's frustratingly simple, but also incredibly difficult when you're in it.
Oh,
To
yeah.
have someone say to you, oh, just meditate and journal and, eat well. And it's like, that's the last bloody thing I feel like doing, but it's recommended for a reason.
And then there's the people that are able to show up on their social media in real time as they're going through something.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how they do that.
Well, I guess it depends how they're showing up.
Yeah.
uh, I think it's really important that life doesn't stop because we go through stuff.
Mm.
So we can still turn up on socials or turn up to our jobs or turn up to our loved ones. We may not want to divulge, say, on socials, everything that's just gone on in our private world. But I think there's something to be said for still showing up in
Yeah.
the world.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, it demonstrates, I think, a real sense of resilience and courage as long as it's not masking. I think the point you're making is the happy person on the socials who's actually falling apart as soon as the camera's off.
Well, no, I
But
actually mean when people are like, here I am today, something like, and they're going through it in that moment and
and sharing in the
sharing
moment.
as like
Oh,
as the car crash is happening in slow motion. I mean, I just I need to process things in my own world before I can
yes.
bring that to and decide what the narrative is and how I've come to terms with
Well,
it.
and I mean, this is a whole other conversation, but like, does everyone need to know every single step of your own? Like, in my social media is just a whole other beast, but I'm like, does anyone really care that much about what I'm thinking today or what I'm eating or like? And so I don't normally share that, but I
You'd be
think
surprised. You'd be surprised, Helen.
maybe. I certainly don't find it that interesting for myself. Mind you, I do enjoy watching what other people are doing. But anywho, yes, I can't just turn up. Like, I love that you say in the middle of the car crash. And in fact, in my first book, and you already know, I used this analogy that, we're blindfolded and peeking at our social media underneath, and we're trying to drive with one hand, and we don't even know that we're about to, come off the road and into a ditch because we're not paying attention. So, yeah, hats off to people who are in that place, but I need to sit with it and feel it and process it before someone else is invited into that.
Yeah. But what's interesting though, as you shared just before about processing your own fear with the beginning of the pandemic and whatever else you had to navigate through that, what I saw, I mean, there was a part of, as I heard that, I went, oh yeah, Helen's a human. She had fear through that. Like, obviously,
See, I am a human.
but it was interesting because I only experienced you showing up as a leader and a very grounded voice through that time on your podcast and those conversations we had, and it's just interesting how when we are able to, I suppose, have two different connections, like we've got the connection to our humanness and our head, and then the connection to our heart or our intuition, what that can allow us to be through such times as well. And you were such a leader of, I would say, balance and calm, and it's not that it's
well,
all
thank
okay,
you.
but that sense, and possibly I imagine that's how people perceive me on the podcast as well, which is a nice thing to be able to do.
Yes, because what you're seeing in me, we're all seeing in you.
Oh, isn't that funny? We're
Yes.
all connected, we're all
Yes.
one.
Very interesting. But it does help to also have some higher guidance. And so I think a lot of, to your point, in that pandemic, there was human Helen processing how do we manage the kids, the juggle, and like my husband worked in travel at the time. It was like, how is this going to affect us? And then the flip side of like actually sitting with spirit or channeling for people and going, oh right, this is all fine. Yep, it's okay. And yeah, I guess to that point, perhaps maybe I do show up in the midst of things. I'm going to reflect on that. I think that's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
A nice reflection.
Yeah, it's nice to see that, isn't it? Well, Helen, it has been such a pleasure to connect with you again and have you back on the show. If anyone's interested, go listen to my previous episode with Helen as well. I really grilled you on like, Helen, what do we do when we can't trust life?
And how are you faring with that these days?
Yeah. Well, I mean, are you asking me right now?
Yes, I am.
Much better. I mean,
I know you are.
You've seen me off in Portugal and Bali.
Yes.
Yeah. Life is supporting me as it always has, as it always will. Sometimes that voice is just unsure that it's all going to be okay.
Of course. And then, inevitably you're able to demonstrate that for other people too, right? There will be people watching going, oh my God, she's just done this. And then it has this ripple effect. So we will change the world eventually.
Try and remind people that we're all going to be okay in one way or another.
Yeah, we are.
Thank you so much, Helen. I am so excited for everyone to go and get your book. It's, I believe, in all good bookstores.
It is. It is officially out. You can find it on the shelves pretty much anywhere.
Beautiful. Well, we'll make sure people can find it nice and easily, and pop your details and everything in the show notes so people can find you. Helen, where can we find you? Where do you want us to find you?
Come on over to helenjacobs.co, and actually you can get signed copies of the book there too, or on Instagram. I'm usually hanging out there, which is also at helenjacobs.co. So come play, come talk, come tell me what your heart is desiring and what 2023 is going to be if you listen to your heart.
That's how our connection began. I was reading your book and I reached out. I was like, Helen, this is what's happening for me right now. I just saw some signs from the universe the magic car metaphor, and then I had a car that had magic on the number plate. It was pretty cool.
I love it.
You'd be surprised what happens if you do reach out to Helen. She's lovely. All right, my love. I will make sure that's all in the show notes for everyone. Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks so much, Georgie.
Thank you for listening. We have reached the end of this episode. If you enjoy this podcast and you find it helpful, I would really appreciate it if you would hit subscribe or share this episode on your Instagram stories and make sure you tag @Georgie the Naturopath. But that is all for today. Please be kind to yourselves. Know that you are enough and you are exactly where you need to be.